Adolf Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse in 8 weeks. He was so confident that German soldiers were not issued winter coats. By December, tens of thousands of them had frozen to death in temperatures of 40 below zero, still wearing the summer uniforms they had crossed the border in 6 months earlier. To understand Operation Barbarossa, you have to understand that Hitler had been planning it for nearly 2 decades before it happened. In 1925, while sitting in Landsberg prison after the failed beer hall putsch, Hitler dictated a book called Mein Kampf. Most readers focus on its anti-Semitism, but the book also contained a foreign policy doctrine that almost no one in Western governments took seriously at the time. Hitler argued that Germany's future depended on conquering vast territories in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, displacing or exterminating the Slavic populations who lived there, and resettling those lands with German farmers. He called this concept Lebensraum, which translates to living space. It was not a metaphor. It was a literal plan for the colonization of Eastern Europe by an expanded Aryan race. For Hitler, the war against the Soviet Union was not optional. It was the entire point of Nazi foreign policy. Every other military operation between 1939 and 1941 was, in his mind, a preliminary clearing of the western flank before the main event. The invasion of Poland, the conquest of France, the air campaign against Britain. All of it was preparation for the war that mattered. In August 1939, Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Most historians describe this as a cynical stalling tactic. Hitler had no intention of honoring it. He needed Soviet neutrality only long enough to conquer Western Europe and then turn east. By July 1940, with France defeated and Britain under siege, Hitler ordered his generals to begin planning the invasion of the Soviet Union. The operation was given a code name drawn from a 12th-century German emperor known for his eastern campaigns. They called it Operation Barbarossa. The plan that emerged from German military headquarters between July 1940 and December 1940 was, by any measure, the most ambitious military operation ever conceived. The numbers alone were staggering. 3 million German soldiers, organized into 153 divisions. Another 600,000 troops from Allied countries including Romania, Hungary, Italy, Slovakia, and Finland. A total invasion force of roughly 3.6 million men. Supporting them were 3,500 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft. The supply train included 600,000 motor vehicles and 700,000 horses. The objective was a strategic catastrophe so total that the Soviet Union would simply collapse as a functioning state. German planners did not envision a long war of attrition. They envisioned a single overwhelming campaign of about 8 to 10 weeks that would destroy the Red Army in border battles, capture Moscow and Leningrad, and trigger the political disintegration of the Soviet government. The plan was divided into 3 army groups, each with a specific objective. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, would advance through the Baltic states and capture Leningrad, the second largest city in the Soviet Union and the symbolic birthplace of the Russian Revolution. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, would drive directly toward Moscow along the most direct route, destroying the bulk of the Red Army in a series of encirclement battles along the way. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would conquer Ukraine, capture the industrial cities of the Donbas, and drive south toward the Caucasus oil fields. By the time all 3 army groups had completed their objectives, German planners expected to be standing on a defensive line running from Archangel on the Arctic Ocean to Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea. Everything west of that line would be incorporated into a vast German colonial empire. Everything east of it would be left to collapse into chaos. The estimated timeline for all of this was 10 weeks. Joseph Stalin received more than 80 separate warnings of the impending German invasion in the months before it began. He ignored every single one of them. The warnings came from multiple sources. Soviet spies in Berlin reported the German military buildup. Soviet spies in Tokyo, including the legendary agent Richard Sorge, reported the exact date of the invasion 6 weeks in advance. The British government, which had broken German military codes through the Ultra program, repeatedly informed Stalin of the German threat. Even German deserters who crossed the border in the final days before the attack told their Soviet captors that the invasion would begin at dawn on June 22. Stalin dismissed all of it. He believed Hitler would not be foolish enough to attack the Soviet Union before defeating Britain. He believed the warnings were British attempts to drag him into a war with Germany. He believed his own intelligence services were paranoid. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, a German communist deserter named Alfred Liskow swam across the river separating German-occupied Poland from Soviet-occupied Poland to warn the Soviet border guards that the invasion would begin at 4 a.m. that morning. He was arrested and questioned. The Soviet officers who interrogated him reported his warning to Moscow. Stalin's response was to order Liskow shot for spreading German disinformation. The order to execute Liskow was issued at 3:45 a.m. on June 22, 1941. 15 minutes later, the German invasion began. The Soviet military was caught completely unprepared. Most frontline units had not been ordered to combat readiness. Aircraft were lined up wingtip to wingtip on airfields, making them easy targets. Artillery was stored without ammunition. Soviet officers, terrified of being purged for paranoid behavior, had been ordered not to take defensive precautions that might provoke the Germans. When the German guns opened fire across a 1,800-mile front at dawn on June 22, the largest army in the world was effectively asleep. The opening phase of Operation Barbarossa was, from a German perspective, the most successful military campaign in modern history. In the first day alone, the Luftwaffe destroyed approximately 1,800 Soviet aircraft, most of them on the ground. Soviet airfields had been mapped in detail by German reconnaissance flights in the months before the invasion, and the opening airstrikes were devastating. Within a week, the Soviet Air Force as a coherent fighting force had effectively ceased to exist on the Western Front. On the ground, the German army advanced at a pace that astonished even its own planners. Panzer divisions broke through Soviet defensive positions, drove deep into Soviet territory, and then turned inward to encircle massive pockets of Soviet troops. The first major encirclement, at Białystok and Minsk in late June, trapped over 300,000 Soviet soldiers. Most surrendered within days. In early July, a second encirclement at Smolensk trapped another 300,000. In August, a third at Uman trapped 100,000. In September, the largest encirclement in military history at Kiev trapped 665,000 Soviet soldiers, including the entire Soviet Southwestern Front. It remains the largest single capture of prisoners ever recorded in any war. By the end of September 1941, the Germans had captured approximately 2.5 million Soviet prisoners of war. They had advanced 600 miles into Soviet territory. They had occupied an area larger than France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Denmark combined. From every measurable perspective, the campaign was succeeding beyond expectations. And yet, behind the front lines, three problems were beginning to undermine the entire operation. The first was logistics. The German army had outrun its supply lines. Trains could only deliver fuel and ammunition as fast as the captured Soviet rail network could be converted to the narrower European gauge, which took weeks. Trucks broke down on Soviet roads, which were unpaved dirt that turned to deep mud after every rainstorm. The 700,000 horses that supported the German invasion force began dying in large numbers from exhaustion and lack of fodder. The second was the unexpected resilience of the Red Army. Despite catastrophic losses, the Soviets kept producing more divisions. German intelligence had estimated that the Soviet Union could field roughly 200 divisions. By August 1941, it had identified over 360 Soviet divisions in combat, with no sign of the supply running out. The Soviet population was 196 million. Replacement reserves were essentially infinite. The third was the most disturbing. Behind the German army, in the territories that had supposedly been conquered, the war was not actually over. Operation Barbarossa was not a normal military campaign. It was, by Hitler's explicit order, a war of racial extermination. In March 1941, 3 months before the invasion began, Hitler issued what became known as the Commissar Order. It directed German army units to summarily execute any captured Soviet political officer, called a commissar, without trial. This was a direct violation of the laws of war. The German army accepted the order without resistance. A second directive, the Barbarossa Decree, instructed German soldiers that they could not be prosecuted for crimes committed against Soviet civilians. Rape, murder, theft, and arson by German troops would not be punished by German military courts. The decree explicitly stated that the war in the East was to be conducted without regard to traditional military law. A third order created the Einsatzgruppen, 4 SS task forces of approximately 3,000 men total, who would follow the German army into Soviet territory and systematically murder civilians. Their primary targets were Jews, Communist Party officials, Roma, and anyone the SS classified as racially undesirable. The Einsatzgruppen began their work within hours of crossing the border. Over the following 18 months, these 3,000 men shot approximately 1.5 million people, most of them Jewish civilians, in mass executions across Soviet territory. The most infamous single massacre took place at a ravine outside Kyiv called Babi Yar. Over 2 days in late September 1941, SS units shot 33,771 Jews. The killings were so methodical that German military officers brought picnic lunches to watch. For Soviet prisoners of war, the situation was also catastrophic. German planners had not made adequate provisions for the millions of prisoners they expected to capture. They had no intention of doing so. Hitler considered Soviet POWs to be subhuman Slavs who could be allowed to die through neglect. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany during the war, 3.3 million died in captivity. Most died of starvation, exposure, or disease in open-air camps where they were given no food, no shelter, and no medical care. The death rate among Soviet POWs in German custody was approximately 58%. By comparison, the death rate for British and American POWs in German custody was approximately 4%. The war of extermination created its own consequences. Soviet civilians who might have welcomed liberation from Stalin's regime, particularly in Ukraine and the Baltic states, instead found themselves facing systematic murder. Within months, partisan resistance movements were forming behind German lines. By 1942, these partisans were tying down hundreds of thousands of German troops in anti-guerrilla operations that had nothing to do with the front-line war. The Germans were creating their own enemies faster than they could defeat them. In late August 1941, with German armies advancing on every front, Hitler made a decision that his generals had been arguing against for weeks. He ordered Army Group Center, which had been driving directly toward Moscow, to halt and divert significant forces south to support the Kiev encirclement. The Kiev operation was a tactical triumph. It produced the largest capture of prisoners in history. But it cost the Germans the one resource they could not replace: time. By the time Army Group Center resumed its advance on Moscow in early October, 6 weeks had been lost. Soviet forces had used the time to construct new defensive lines around the capital. Civilian volunteers had dug 700 miles of anti-tank ditches around Moscow. Factories had been evacuated to the Ural Mountains, beyond the range of German air attack. Most importantly, fresh divisions from the Soviet Far East had been transferred westward. This last development was a gift from Soviet intelligence. Richard Sorge, the Soviet spy in Tokyo who had warned Stalin of the original invasion, now reported that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union from the east. With his eastern flank secure, Stalin could move his Siberian divisions west. By December, 15 Soviet divisions trained for winter warfare had arrived on the Moscow front. The German offensive against Moscow, called Operation Typhoon, began on October 2, 1941. It made initial progress, encircling another 600,000 Soviet soldiers at Vyazma and Bryansk. Panic spread through Moscow. The Soviet government began evacuating to Kybyshev, 500 miles east. Stalin himself considered leaving but ultimately decided to stay. Then the weather changed. The first heavy rains arrived in mid-October. The Soviet roads, never paved, dissolved into seas of mud so deep that German tanks bogged down to their turrets. Trucks could not move. Horses could not pull artillery. The German advance ground to a halt for almost 3 weeks. When the ground finally froze in early November, the Germans resumed their advance. By early December, lead elements of the 2nd Panzer Division had reached the suburbs of Moscow. They could see the towers of the Kremlin through binoculars. That was as close as they would ever get. On December 5, 1941, with German forces frozen in their forward positions and unable to advance further, the Soviet Union launched a counterattack that no German commander had thought possible. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet commander on the Moscow front, had been quietly assembling a strategic reserve of more than 1 million men, including the Siberian divisions that had arrived from the Far East. These troops were equipped for winter warfare. They wore quilted jackets, Valenki felt boots, and white camouflage. They were trained in winter operations and supported by the T-34 tank, which performed better in extreme cold than any German design. The German army, by contrast, had been stripped of even basic winter equipment. Hitler's planners had not believed the campaign would extend into winter. By December, German soldiers were stuffing their summer uniforms with newspaper for insulation. Frostbite cases exceeded combat casualties. German tanks would not start in the mornings because their lubricants had frozen solid. The Soviet counterattack drove German forces back from Moscow by 60 to 150 miles, depending on the sector. It was the first major defeat of the German army in the Second World War. It demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could be beaten. and it permanently ended any hope of completing Operation Barbarossa on its original timeline. Hitler responded by relieving more than 30 senior generals, including the commanders of all three army groups. He took personal command of the German army himself. From December 1941 onward, every major operational decision on the Eastern Front would require his approval. This was the second great mistake of Operation Barbarossa, after the initial underestimation of Soviet strength. By placing himself at the center of every military decision, Hitler ensured that German commanders in the field could no longer respond to changing circumstances without his permission. The flexible, decentralized command style that had won the early battles of the war was replaced with rigid micromanagement from a leader who increasingly refused to accept bad news. The German army would continue to win battles on the Eastern Front for another 18 months. But it would never again come close to winning the war. Operation Barbarossa officially ended in early 1942, when the German military formally abandoned its original objectives and adopted a new strategic plan focused on the Caucasus oil fields. But in a deeper sense, Barbarossa never really ended. It simply became the longer war that consumed the Eastern Front for the next 3.5 years. The casualties on both sides defy comprehension. The Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people during the war, of whom about 11 million were soldiers. Civilian deaths from starvation, mass shootings, exposure, and military operations accounted for the remaining 16 million. Belarus lost a quarter of its pre-war population. Ukraine lost approximately 7 million people. Leningrad alone lost 1.5 million civilians during the 872-day siege, most of them to starvation in a city where the only food available during the winter of 1941-1942 was sawdust bread and, for some, the bodies of the dead. Germany and its allies lost approximately 5 million soldiers killed on the Eastern Front, which was 80% of all German military deaths in the entire Second World War. The war in the East killed more Germans than every other theater of the war combined, by a factor of 4. For comparison, total American military deaths in the entire Second World War, in all theaters, were approximately 405,000. Total British military deaths were approximately 384,000. The Eastern Front killed more soldiers in some individual battles than the United States lost in the entire war. The numbers are so large that they stop functioning as numbers. They become statistics in the most literal sense, abstract figures detached from the human reality of millions of individual deaths. This is one of the reasons the Eastern Front is so often underrepresented in Western popular culture. It is simply too large and too horrible to be processed. But the strategic outcome of Operation Barbarossa was clear by January 1942. Hitler had attacked the Soviet Union expecting an 8-week victory. Instead, he had committed Germany to a war of attrition against an enemy with 3 times its population and, eventually, more industrial output than Germany could ever match. The arithmetic of that war could only end one way. Operation Barbarossa shaped the second half of the 20th century in ways that are still being felt today. The Soviet victory on the Eastern Front established the Red Army as the dominant military force in Eastern and Central Europe by 1945. The political consequences of that fact created the Iron Curtain, the division of Germany, the Warsaw Pact, and the entire structure of the Cold War. Every conflict from the Berlin airlift to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 traces back, ultimately, to the territorial outcome of the war Hitler started in June 1941. The cultural memory of Barbarossa also shaped post-war Russia. The Soviet government called the war the Great Patriotic War, and it became the founding myth of Soviet identity. Even today, More than 3 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Victory Day on May 9 remains the most important national holiday in Russia. The memory of the 27 million Soviet dead is woven into the political identity of every Russian generation, including those born long after the war ended. This memory has consequences in the present. Russian leaders, including Vladimir Putin, have repeatedly invoked the legacy of the Great Patriotic War to justify modern military operations. The framing of contemporary Russian foreign policy as a continuing struggle against Western aggression, fascism, and encirclement draws directly from the cultural memory of 1941. The other legacy of Barbarossa is the one historians find hardest to communicate. The war on the Eastern Front established a precedent for industrial-scale warfare against civilian populations that has shaped every subsequent conflict. The deliberate starvation of cities, the systematic murder of ethnic populations, the mobilization of entire societies for total war. All of these reached a level of intensity in 1941 and 1942 that had no historical precedent. Some of those methods have since been used in other wars, by other powers, in other places. None of them have been used at the scale of Operation Barbarossa. The largest land war in human history is also the largest cautionary tale in human history. Operation Barbarossa was not defeated by Russian winter, or Russian distance, or Russian numbers, although all of those mattered. It was defeated by a single false belief held by Adolf Hitler. Hitler believed that the Soviet Union was a fragile state that would collapse at the first serious blow. He believed that Slavic populations were biologically inferior and would not fight effectively. He believed that German racial superiority would compensate for any logistical or numerical disadvantage. He believed all of this so completely that he committed 3 million soldiers to an operation based on it, and he refused to revise his beliefs even as the evidence accumulated against them. That is the deepest lesson of Operation Barbarossa. The largest military operation in human history, executed by what was at the time the most professional army in the world, failed because the man who ordered it could not distinguish between his ideology and reality. 27 million Soviet citizens died for that mistake. 5 million German soldiers died for that mistake. The world that emerged from the ruins still bears the marks of it. That is the entire history of Operation Barbarossa. If you found this video valuable, consider subscribing for more deep dive history content. Thank you for watching.